Fiscal reform to benefit state and local governments. The Modern Money Theory Approach by L. Randall Wray. The Government Budget Constraint, Fact, and Fancy. Economic theory proposes that consumers face a budget constraint, such that consumption cannot exceed income plus borrowing capacity, which itself is a function of future income. And all debts must be paid, so lifetime spending equals lifetime income. In the late 1960s, the notion of a budget constraint began to be applied to government in the form of the Government Budget Constraint, GBC. G equals T plus DB plus DM, where G stands for government spending, including transfers, interest payments, and purchases. T is tax revenue. DB is borrowing, bond issues. And DM is printing money. Issuing bonds carries two main drawbacks. Government borrowing competes with private borrowing, pushing up interest rates that can crowd out private borrowing and thus reduce investment. And bond issue commits government to paying interest plus principal in the future. Printing money is dangerous because it can cause inflation. Economists develop sustainability conditions to ensure budget deficits do not cause government debt ratios to become excessive. Sustainability depends on the relation between the rate of GDP growth and the interest rate. The rate on government debt must be below the GDP growth rate or the debt ratio will grow without limit. Wray 2015. The problem is that budget deficits can lower the growth rate by crowding out private investment, which is presumed to be one of the main sources of growth, and raise interest rates competing for scarce supply of loanable funds. Thus, there is a likelihood that interest rates will rise above growth rates, causing the debt ratio to grow, therefore raising spending on interest unsustainably. In recent years, some orthodox economists have developed a new approach to budgeting, advocating the use of intergenerational accounting that projects government revenue as well as spending commitments through an infinite horizon. Kotlikoff and Burns, 2005. These two flows are discounted to determine the shortfall, unfunded commitments, through eternity. Scary numbers like $200 trillion of unfunded entitlements due to Social Security and Medicare program shortfalls can be generated. These are said to be the burden of the debt we are leaving for our grandkids, who will face much higher tax rates to service and ultimately pay down the debt. The presumption is that the government, like a household, must eventually repay all debt. Hence, all deficit spending represents a future tax obligation. In that sense, borrowing is just postponing taxes and not a substitute for tax revenue. Printing money is not a solution either, as that is just an inflation tax that reduces the purchasing power of money income. Our grandkids will have to pay for our profligacy, whether government borrows or prints money. From the MMT of perspective, there are many problems with this. From the perspective of MMT, there are many problems with this. First, the government budget constraint is seen by MMT as an ex post identity, not a constraint. Second, budget deficits place downward pressure on interest rates, not upward. Third, the loanable funds view of finance was already revealed by Keynes to be false. Fourth, a sovereign government that issues its own currency can never be forced to miss any payment as it comes due, so there is no sustainability problem. Fifth, government debt is financial wealth, so leaving debts to our grandkids is a source of wealth, not a burden. Sixth, government debt does not need to be repaid. Seventh, it is unrealistic to hold the growth rate, G, constant, as government spending, including spending on interest, and debt rise without limit. The fiscal stimulus would raise the growth rate above the interest rate and resolve the unsustainability problem. Eighth, the interest rate is a policy variable, so it can be held below the growth rate. Though each of these points would require a full paper for a thorough exposition, I will provide a quick explanation for each, with references for further reading. The so-called government budget constraint is an ex post identity, not a constraint, in the sense that at the end of the accounting period, say a fiscal year, it will be identically true that government spending over the period will equal taxes received, plus the sum of net bonds and net bank reserves accumulated. As discussed above, government spending always leads to a credit to banking system reserves, dollar for dollar. As the Fed makes payments for the Treasury, the private bank receiving the credit will in turn credit the deposit account of the recipient of the Treasury spending. Tax payments reverse this, resulting in debits to bank reserves. If the government spending flow happened to exactly equal the flow of tax payments, the net impact on bank reserves and bank accounts of taxpayers would be zero. But if spending exceeds taxes, then the deficit means that there have been net credits to banking system reserves. Normally, banks do not want to hold excess reserves and require reserves grow very slowly over the course of a year. So most of the reserves created will be exchanged for Treasury bonds, sold either by the Fed in the secondary markets, called an open market sale, or by the Treasury in the new issue market. This is why the identity holds at the end of the period. Over the course of the year, all three operations, tax receipts, bond sales, and reserve credits, are used on a continuous basis. That is true even if the government will end up with a balanced budget at the end of the year. This is because of the operational procedures adopted by the Treasury and Fed, discussed above, used to handle payments made by the Treasury. These procedures are complicated and they evolve over time. The point is that even if the government is running a budget surplus, it will issue bonds and print money, credit reserves, as well, over the course of the year. In other words, these are not optional ways ways to pay for spending. In other words, these are not optional ways to pay for spending, but are simply different parts of the normal procedures to effectuate government spending. All government spending actually takes the form of a credit to bank reserves. This is simultaneous with the spending, and there is no alternative in the modern economy. Footnote 13. In the old days, the government spent by issuing paper money or coins, usually through the Treasury, but today it spends through its central banks. End footnote. Since government spending results in reserve credits, and deficits create net reserve credits, bond sales function to drain excess reserves, providing a higher interest-earning alternative. Bond sales keep excess reserves from driving interest rates down. Deficit spending doesn't cause crowding out in the absence of bond sales. It would push rates down. In a sense, the bond sales are a policy option. If government didn't want to sell them, it could adopt slightly different procedures, and in that case it would leave the reserves created by government spending in the banking system, which would drive the overnight interest rate down to the central bank's support rate, what it pays on excess reserves. Alternatively, the central bank can buy all bonds in the secondary markets. In this case, Treasury payments of interest to the central bank are returned to the Treasury. In the United States, Fed profits above a 6% return go to the Treasury. Government interest payments on bonds held outside the central bank are optional, but whatever interest the government decides it will pay, it will always be able to afford to pay it. All payments the government commits can be paid as discussed above, through credits to bank reserves. Even if the interest rate were above the growth rate, the government can make those payments as a government never needs to repay its debt. Even without knowing any theory, it is easy to check to see whether the U.S. government has been paying off its debt since the founding of the nation. Uncle Sam retired the debt only once, during President Jackson's administration. In almost every other year since the founding of the nation, the debt has grown. There were a half-dozen short periods during which some of the debt was retired. The last time was during the Clinton administration, but each was ended with another run-up of debt. Of the 7 periods, counting the Jackson episode, of sustained budget surpluses, all but the Clinton surplus was followed by one of our 6 depressions. The Clinton surplus was followed by the dot-com collapse, recession, and then a speculative bubble that crashed into the global financial crisis. Why the correlation of budget surpluses and downturns? Maybe it is more than a coincidence. A federal budget surplus means, by identity, that the non-government sectors taken as a whole are running deficits. This follows from Godley's sectoral balances. The sum of the balances across the government sector, domestic private sector, and foreign sector is 0. For every sectoral surplus, there must be at least one sectoral deficit. If we assume the foreign sector is in balance, the current account is balanced, and then the government runs a surplus, the domestic private sector must run a deficit, and vice versa. Retirement of government debt means, by identity, a reduction of the non-government sector's net financial wealth. That is not a good thing. Footnote 14. In the case of the United States and other nations that run current account deficits, the implication of a government sector surplus is even more dire. The private sector's deficit equals the sum of the budget surplus and the current account deficit. End footnote. This relationship is related to Keynes's argument against the loanable funds view, also related to the view of banks as intermediaries that lend on the deposits they receive. The fundamental principle behind Keynes's theory is that spending creates income, and it is the spending injection that creates the income that can be leaked. Thus, investment creates saving in the simplest model, with no government or foreign sector. In the expanded model, investment plus the budget deficit plus net exports creates the income that can be saved. It thus makes no sense to argue that savings finances investment and the budget deficit, or even that taxes can finance government spending. While the causation can run from saving to investment or budget deficit at the individual level, at the aggregate level, the logic must go from injection to leakage. Every leakage requires an income flow. This is why post-war Keynesians saw a positive role for government in supporting aggregate demand. It doesn't need income first to spend. As New York Fed chairman and Rooseveltian New Dealer, Beardsley Ruml put in his title in 1946, taxes for revenue are obsolete. He went on to enumerate useful purposes for taxes, reducing sin and inequality, and to remove aggregate demand to fight inflation, but insisted that the war had taught the people and the government that taxes are not needed to finance government spending. Indeed, Keynes's logic taught us that government needs to spend first to generate the income that can be taxed. While it is true that reserves can come from Fed lending, that is normally a tiny amount in relation to Treasury spending. Quantitative easing changed that somewhat. The Fed provided several $1 trillion of reserves as it bought U.S. Treasury bonds and mortgage-backed securities. Banks now have sufficient reserves to cover a couple of years' worth of tax payments. However, if the government stopped spending but continued to collect taxes, this would suck so much income and financial wealth out of the tax-paying public that a depression would be inevitable. Economic growth requires spending injections, and modern economies generally need net injections from the government. This is less critical for net exporters, as their spending injection can come from foreigners. Think Germany or Taiwan, who rely on exports. Since the days of President Reagan, however, the United States has been running chronic current account deficits, a leakage that now reaches to 6% of GDP or more when the United States is growing at a reasonable pace. Injections can also come from investment spending. If investment exceeds private sector saving, it is a net injection. However, investment-led growth is not sustainable for a rich, developed country like the United States. This is because, ironically, investment tends to be too productive. As Ives Domar, 1948, worried in the early post-war period that investment has two effects, a demand-side multiplier effect and a supply-side capacity effect. If investment raises capacity more than it raises aggregate demand, we are left with excess capacity that depresses further investment. We then need another source of demand, either government or exports. In the early post-war period of the United States, we relied on both, but over time our allies and our former foes rebuilt and we lost our trade surplus. That meant we had to rely on the government to keep demand high enough to use the plant and equipment we added. The best research on this Domar problem is by economists Harold Vader and John Walker, 1989, 1990, 1997, and Ray 2008. In a series of books, they demonstrated that over the course of the whole 20th century, there was a tendency towards secular stagnation that was relieved only when government spending grew faster than GDP, thereby providing the required extra demand. They attributed the serious downturns to periods in which government spending grew more slowly than GDP. During World War II, as well as over the early post-war period, federal government spending grew faster than GDP, producing relatively rapid growth. By around 1960, federal spending reached a plateau, settling in at around a fifth of the economy, growing at the same pace as GDP. However, state and local government spending grew faster than GDP, thanks to the provisioning requirements of the baby boom, hospitals, schools, suburban infrastructure. That lasted until the early 1970s. Since that time, total government spending has remained relatively constant as a percent of GDP, with some exceptions, such as the Reagan defense buildup. Periodic tax cuts have reduced the leakage into taxes, so while government has not been a positive force for growth, only growing in line with GDP, it has sometimes reduced its drag on growth. However, and this is important, because the tax cuts have generally been aimed at the rich or business firms, they do not have much bang for the buck. As Minsky argued, the budget deficits created by tax cuts, as well as by interest payments on government debt run-up since the Reagan tax cuts, are inefficient. Unlike New Deal and early post-war government spending that boosted both demand and capacity, Minsky 1992, Ray 2018. The consequence has been chronic underperformance of the economy, which depresses investment in a negative, self-reinforcing manner, even as large budget deficit fails to provide the positive stimulus needed to raise growth.